Everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Alvin Rosenfeld, the director of Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, and it's a special pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating webinar with Fernando Lottenberg. We'll begin that in just a minute. Those of you who regularly tune in know that my good friend and colleague Gunter Yekeli always joins us. He sends greetings to everyone and also excuses. He's tied up with another conflict today that he just couldn't get out of. I'm happy to be joined by one of our graduate students here, Alicia Breton. I'll introduce Alicia to you a bit later. Alicia will prove to be especially helpful to us in the discussion period. This, I believe, is already our 34th webinar on global anti-Semitism, but when I hear myself say global in this respect, I realize that until now, we've been a bit remiss because we've not taken a good hard look at developments in Latin America. A part of the country, Mr. Lottenberg can correct me if I'm wrong a bit later, which has perhaps as many as 500,000 Jews living in several countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico foremost among them. But the fact of the matter is there are numbers of Jews living in any of a number of other Latin American countries. At a time when anti-Semitism has gone global, they're no more immune to some of the threats that befall Jews in Europe, Middle Eastern countries, Australia, New Zealand, and certainly the United States as well. So it's really a wonderful contribution that Commissioner Lottenberg will be making to us and speaking to us about developments in his part of the world. He's a very distinguished figure in his native Brazil. He served as a constitutional lawyer in that country. He held a Fulbright that took him to the University of Texas, so he's fully familiar with America as well. He's been president of the Federation of Jewish Communities of Brazil. He's currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of Latin American and Latino Affairs of the American Jewish Committee, and his appointment was particularly hailed by David Harris, the CEO of the AJC. Most importantly for our purposes, broadly conceived, about, well, if I'm not mistaken, in June of 2021, he was appointed the first OAS commissioner for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. Next week, we're going to hear from Erwin Cutler, who occupies a similar position in Canada. Each of our speakers in this regard will have lots and lots to say. Commissioner Lottenberg, it's my great pleasure now to hand over to you. He will speak to us for around about 20 minutes or so. Following that, there will be ample time for questions and answers and discussion. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Alvin. Alicia, first of all, I'd like to thank Indiana University through its Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism for having me here today in the person of Professor Alvin and Dr. Gunter Yekeli. The position of a commissioner to monitor and combat anti-Semitism in the Americas was created by Secretary General Luis Almagro last June, and I was appointed on October. The Organization of American States is the world's oldest regional organization, dating back to the first International Conference of American States held in Washington, D.C. from October 1889 to April 1890. That meeting approved the establishment of the International Union of American Republics and the stage was set for the weaving of a web of provisions and institutions that came to be known as the Inter-American System, the oldest international institutional system. The OAS, as we note it today, came into being in its current shape in 1948, with the signing in Bogota, Colombia, of the Charter of the OAS, which entered into force in December 1951 and subsequently amended. The organization was established in order to achieve, among its member states, as stipulated in Article 1 of its charter, an order of peace and justice to promote their solidarity, to strengthen their collaboration, and to defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and their independence. Today, the OAS brings together all 35 independent states of the Americas and constitutes the main political, legal, and social governmental forum in the hemisphere. In addition, it has granted permanent observer status to 69 states, as well as to the European Union. The organization uses a four-pronged approach to effectively implement its essential purposes, based on its main pillars: democracy, human rights, security, and development. And in order to achieve its objectives, it's organized through a few structures, such as the General Assembly, the meeting of consultation of ministers of foreign affairs, the councils, the Permanent Council and the Inter-American Council, the Inter-American Legal Committee, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the General Secretariat, and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. Among the mandate items that Mr. Almagro has granted upon the Commissioner, we can find the structuration of a database of incidents in the region, court decisions, governmental policies, to conceive and design measures to increase the level of knowledge of past and present manifestations of anti-Semitism, as well as the danger they pose to democracy in the region, to stimulate member states and organizations to adopt the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism already adopted by OAS itself. I see it as an excellent opportunity to move the debate outside the sphere of the Jewish communities, now with a regional and supranational approach. My first remark today is on our issue is that anti-Semitism cannot be seen as a phenomenon that happens in the vacuum, nor it was brought to our societies by extraterrestrials. It's a symptom of something deeper, of a social trend that has to be analyzed as a threat to democracy and a violation of human rights. Minorities must be respected and assured a safe life in an environment where they can thrive. Our continent, especially Latin America, was founded and developed under the influence of counter-reform, either through the setting up of tribunals or through the so-called visitations. The Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisitions were present and active in our region for more than 3 centuries. This obviously carried a strong influence in the local perception of the Jews. There are records of Jewish communities established in Brazil since the country's discovery in 1500, having arrived in different times. The Portuguese king had expelled the Jews that would not convert to Christianism 3 years before in 1497. They arrived in Brazil during the period of the Dutch rule, setting up in Recife the first synagogue in the Americas, the Kahal Tzur Israel, as early as 1636. And most of those Jews were Sephardic Jews who had fled the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal to the religious freedom of the Netherlands. The Portuguese Inquisition expanded its scope of operations from mainland Portugal to its colonial possessions, including Brazil, where it continued investigating and trying cases based on supposed breaches of Orthodox Roman Catholicism until 1821. We can say that this only started to change 55 years ago with the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate that reset the relationship of the Catholic Church and Judaism. Still on the side of the so-called traditional anti-Semitism, but with a neo-Nazi or right-wing background, we have watched in some countries of our continent a certain self-assurance that those thoughts could be exposed publicly, be it verbally or through violent acts, such as the march in Charlottesville, where people were marching with torches saying Jews will not replace us, or in Pittsburgh with the shooting of 11 people at the synagogue Tree of Life 3 years ago. Latin America was a destination for German emigration in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. The largest Nazi party outside of the Reich could be found in Brazil during the 30s and the 40s. And though Brazil entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1942 and was the only Latin American country to send troops, after the end of the Second World War, South America became a route of escape to former Nazi criminals, especially in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay. Regarding this issue, I would like to bring your attention to a legal case that was tried at the Brazilian Supreme Court in 2004 that became emblematic in what relates to Holocaust denial and revisionism, resulting in the first court conviction on the grounds of anti-Semitism in Latin America. A book publisher called Siegfried Ellwanger Castan, which was the owner of a publishing house called Revision, in the south of Brazil, published a series of books denying the Holocaust, including one of his own authorship, Holocaust, Jew or German, the backstage of the century's lie. In that book, he denied the existence of concentration camps and the death of 6 million Jews during World War II. Part of his catalog were books such as The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, The International Jew by Henry Ford, Brazil, a Banker's Colony, or Hitler, Guilty or Not Guilty. In 2003, the Superior Court had convicted Ellwanger to 2 years of jail for incitement to racism. The defense appealed the decision on the grounds that Jews are not a race, and therefore there was no crime of racism. Any similarity, if I may add, to Whoopi Goldberg's statement last week is not a coincidence. However, the Supreme Court did not accept the appeal. And I quote, "The setting up of the judicial definition of the word racism requires the combination of historic, political, and social factors and circumstances that guided its formation and use. The crime of racism constitutes an attack on the principles in which human society is built and organized, based on the human being's respectability and dignity and his peaceful coexistence. Based on the assumption that there are no biological divisions of the human species, the court understood that the subdivisions of human beings in races results of a process of merely political and social content. This process gave origin to racism, which in turn generates discrimination and segregationist prejudice. To build the judicial definition of the word racism, the court concluded that it's necessary to combine historic, political, and social factors, as well as circumstances that governed its formation and application through a finalistic and systematic interpretation of the Constitution. Only then it's possible to get the law's real sense and reach. This should reconcile etymologic, ethnologic, anthropologic, and biological concepts. Thus, it was stated that the crime of racism is apparent in the mere utilization of the above stigma, which runs against the principles of which human society is based and organized, on the respectability and dignity of the human being and his specific coexistence in the social milieu. Therefore, it was recognized that the publishing of material with anti-Semitic ideas that tries to give credibility to the racial conception defined by the Nazi regime, that deny and subvert undisputed historic facts, such as the Holocaust, in the form of the supposed inferiority and disqualification of the Jewish people, is comparable to incitement, to discrimination, with a striking racist context and reinforced by the historic consequences of those actions on which they are based. The court plenary put to the record that, due to the gravity and repulsiveness of the offense, the federal constitution imposed on the agents of crimes of this nature the non-application of statute of limitations clause, so that ad perpetuum, forever, the repudiation and objection of the Brazilian society to this practice will be censored and repudiated. Finally, it was established that as any individual right, the constitutional guarantee of freedom of expression is not absolute and can be set aside when it surpasses the moral and judicial limits, such as in the case of expressions of immoral content that imply criminal unlawfulness. This precedent set basis for many other cases that involve limits to the freedom of expression, to which we will return later. Moving to the other side now of the political spectrums, we have seen objections directed to Israel policies reaching dangerous levels, not limited to a government's decisions critique, but questioning the very existence of the state itself and its delegitimization. As Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the ADL CEO, has mentioned, anti-Semitism on the left is similar to climate change. Slowly but surely, the temperature is rising. There are occasional storms, but too often people choose to ignore the signs and deny that there is a pattern. But by all measures, the metaphorical temperature is climbing, the condition is worsening, and this situation threatens to upend life as we know it. The recent report of Amnesty International calling Israel an apartheid state, as well as some political leaders calling it a genocidal state, and we have seen that in Chile, and I was there for my first mission as the commissioner, and the new president and his Ministry of Culture more than once called Israel a genocidal state, contribute to the demonization of Israel with negative effects towards the Jewish communities in the diaspora. We could see it during manifestations about the conflicts between Israel and Hamas last May. In the USA, as you know, Jewish diners were attacked at restaurants in LA, New York, and also in Florida. In other countries of our region, such as Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, and others, manifestations equating Israel to Nazi Germany and David stars to swastikas were seen on the streets and on social media. In some countries, like Venezuela, there was even some government involvement in that campaign. The idea that Jews around the world can be collectively held accountable for what happens in the Middle East reached a new dimension. Because we don't see immigrants or refugees of other countries being targeted in their new homes for decisions made by their former governments. It's surely a double standard, and it may be called, without reservations, by its name. This is anti-Semitism. And if we see the last FBI report about hate crimes, despite being only 2% of US population, 60% of hate crimes based on religious reasons were directed against Jews. In both cases, right or left, we see anti-Semitism being normalized and becoming mainstream, as if it were a legitimate discourse and being instrumentalized to be used as a political tool in a fight against the other side, left versus right and vice versa, much more than a problem that needs to be faced and addressed. The identitarian policies add to that dangerous atmosphere, since the extreme right don't see Jews as whites, while the far left see us as super whites, privileged, and etc. Besides these two conceptions of anti-Semitism, traditional one and the left-wing one, the third vertex of this triangle is the Islamic fundamentalism. In Latin America, Argentina has been the most important example. It's worth mentioning that Argentina is the only Latin American country to have recorded 2 terrorist attacks moved by anti-Semitism. In Buenos Aires, on March 17, 1992, a bomb was thrown against the Israeli embassy, leaving 29 dead and about 200 injured people. In addition, in the morning of July 18, 1994, a bomb exploded at the Jewish center Amia, killing 85 people. 28 years later, the most serious attack in the Argentinian history remains unpunished, albeit the authorship of the attack has been credited to the Lebanese Shiite movement Hezbollah and to Iranian government officials. Perhaps because the attack was seen as a terrorist act against the Jewish community and not against Argentina itself. Prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who should go to Congress on January 19, 2015, to share his finding about a memorandum of understanding to be signed between Argentina and Iran, was found dead in his apartment at that very morning. Up to now, 7 years later, we don't know what happened. In Brazil, a group of suspects of trying to commit terrorist acts was arrested before the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro in 2016. In their WhatsApp messages, the intention of hitting Jewish targets was found. They are still in jail. And recently, we had the visit of Mohsen Hazei, an Iranian vice president who is in Interpol Red Alert in Nicaragua at the Daniel Ortega swearing in his ceremony as a re-elected president for the 3rd time. And I don't have to tell you, at the Beit Israel congregation in Colville, Dallas, Malik Faisal Akram came from the United Kingdom to try to liberate an Al-Qaeda member serving a prison time for attempted murder close to the synagogue through the kidnapping and death threats of its members. As Rabbi Angela Buchdal of Central Synagogue in New York said during her sermon 1 week ago, if you are a Jew in America and you are not feeling unsettled, then you're not paying attention. You can extend that to the whole of Americas. During these 2 last weird years, I would like to mention another issue that had a direct impact on our subject, the pandemics. Old tropes based in conspiracy theories, such as that the Jews produced the virus or that the Israelis were not contaminated, have appeared in a series of posts of a Brazilian journalist. I was a witness in his trial 2 months ago. That the Jews own pharmaceutical companies selling vaccines or medicines, somehow taking advantage of the situation, were spread in many countries throughout the Americas. I myself wrote an article in a Brazilian weekly magazine called The Virus of Prejudice in June 2020, showing how much hate speech was spread, along with the COVID-19 pandemics. More recently, anti-vaxxers were seen wearing yellow stars in a preposterous comparison to Holocaust victims. But my friends, not everything is bad news. On the positive side, and already reaching my conclusions, I would like to mention some initiatives taken in our region during these last years, such as the production of a guide to identify hate speech by the Jewish Federation of Communities in Brazil and the Law School of São Paulo, helping police officers, prosecutors, and judges to characterize and sanction it when they see it. The signing of memorandums of understanding with social networks such as YouTube and TikTok for Jewish organizations to be recognized as trusted flaggers, identifying and reporting anti-Semitic posts in order to have them monitored and in some cases removed with a fast-track mechanism. The Brazilian Supreme Court equated racial insult to racism, which has a much more severe treatment as well as legal sanctions. Brazil was accepted as an observer to IHRA, an organization that already has Argentina as its member and Uruguay as an observer. And 4 countries in the region are not members yet, but have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Teaching of Holocaust was included in the 9th year of Brazilian schools as mandatory, and this shall be expanded to other countries in our regions. And the bill, already approved by the Senate, is being debated in the Brazilian House of Representatives, trying to regulate social media and fake news. It's in fact a bit broader than that, also addressing hate speech and prejudicial posts. In fact, one of the more recent trends is related to the connection between hate speech and anti-Semitism online. The debate about hate speech and its containment and its regulation has been gaining new contours with the changes in the media, especially in the internet. If it was already controversial in traditional media, it has surely taken a new dimension in the dynamics of online communication. And deepening the discussion about the concept of hate speech and seeking to offer sufficiently clear parameters for its identification in concrete cases surely is a task that we cannot avoid anymore. And respecting the specificities of each national legislation, we believe that the key will be found in a combination of the self-regulations of the networks and its legal regulation through legislation and court decisions. 48 countries have been trying to regulate the social networks since 2019. 24 have already approved or submitted propositions to moderate content in the internet. Maybe it's already time for us to think about an international convention on this subject. Thank you very much.